Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Arkansas. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The winter of 1988 settled over the Arkansas Delta with a damp cold that crept indoors and lingered. County birth records from late January show nothing unusual at first glance: routine entries, familiar surnames, expected outcomes. It was not until a handwritten addendum appeared beside one of those entries that attention began to gather. The note was brief, almost careful. Infant transferred for further observation. The child was born just outside Pine Bluff, in a hospital that handled more deliveries than it was equipped to study in detail. Nurses later recalled that the delivery itself was unremarkable. The mother, Ellen Me Harper, was 23, healthy by all accounts, with no complications noted during pregnancy. The father worked seasonal jobs along the river. There were no indicators that the birth would be remembered. What changed the room was the moment the child opened her eyes. Staff accounts vary in wording but not in reaction. One nurse described them as too reflective. Another said they did not seem to focus where expected. A third, in a later affidavit, wrote simply, "I could not tell where she was looking, but I felt she was looking at me." None of these statements were entered into the formal chart. The chart lists only a recommendation for specialist review. Within hours, the infant was transferred north to Little Rock, to Arkansas Children's Hospital, the state's primary pediatric referral center. By the late 1980s, the hospital had already established itself as a place where rare conditions were documented carefully, discussed cautiously, and filed precisely. The admitting physician, Dr. Harold Wexler, noted ocular irregularities without assigning diagnosis. His language was clinical and restrained. Structure present, function unclear. The eyes themselves were not malformed in any obvious way. They were the correct size, set normally, responsive to light. Yet the coloration appeared layered, as though depth existed where none should. Later descriptions compared them to oil on water or glass over something moving. These comparisons never appeared in medical notes. They surfaced later in conversations and personal journals. Testing began immediately. Ophthalmology consulted neurology. Neurology deferred to imaging. Imaging returned results that did not contradict anatomy, yet failed to explain perception. One resident wrote in the margin of a progress note, then crossed it out. Presentation inconsistent. By the third day, rumors had begun circulating among staff, not of monstrosity or miracle, but of uncertainty, the kind that unsettles trained professionals more than abnormality ever could. A senior nurse reportedly warned a trainee not to stare too long. When asked why, she replied, "You start to feel examined." The parents were told only that further observation was required. They agreed quietly. According to a social worker's log, Mrs. Harper asked one question repeatedly: "Is she in pain?" Each time, the answer was no. By the end of the week, the case had been assigned a number, not a name, for internal tracking. That number would reappear years later in places it did not belong. And though no diagnosis was made, one thing was clear even then. The child's eyes did not fit any category the doctors knew how to use. Not yet. Not then. The second week brought specialists from outside the hospital's usual rotation. Pediatric ophthalmologists reviewed the case first, followed by a neurologist from Fayetteville who had published on rare visual processing disorders. Their conclusions, recorded separately, shared a careful tone. Each ruled out known congenital conditions. Each recommended further monitoring. None offered a name. Hospital logs show that the infant, identified internally as case H8814, displayed unusual tracking behavior. When lights moved across the room, her pupils followed, but not directly. They anticipated motion, shifting fractionally ahead of the stimulus. One technician wrote, "Latency appears inverted." The note was circled twice, then initialed. Nurses assigned to the ward began trading observations quietly. They noted that the child rarely cried when left alone, yet became restless when watched for extended periods. One nurse claimed the baby calmed only when placed near a window at night, facing outward. This detail appears in a personal notebook, not in the official chart. By mid-February, the case reached the hospital's ethics review board, not because of proposed intervention, but because of uncertainty. A memo summarized the issue bluntly. No protocol exists for this presentation. The board advised continued observation and minimal stimulation, a recommendation that would later be questioned. Word of the child spread beyond the hospital. A brief mention appeared in a regional medical bulletin, stripped of detail. Infant presenting atypical ocular response under review. No location was named. Still, several physicians requested access to the case. Most were denied. Ellen Harper visited daily. According to visitor logs, she stayed longer than most parents, often sitting silently beside the crib. A nurse recorded that Mrs. Harper once asked whether blind children could still see people. When pressed to explain, she declined. Testing continued. EEG results showed irregular but non-pathological patterns. Imaging revealed no lesions, no malformations. Every result returned just normal enough to be unusable. Dr. Wexler's frustration appears subtly in his handwriting, which grows tighter as the days pass. In one note he writes, "Observation without hypothesis risks misinterpretation." The first incident occurred on February 19. During a routine overnight check, a nurse reported that the infant's eyes appeared to reflect light from an unlit corridor. Security logs confirmed that no lights were active at the time. The reflection was dismissed as error, fatigue, glare, misremembered detail. The nurse did not return to the ward the following week, citing reassignment. After that night, staff behavior changed. Curtains were drawn more often. Crib placement was adjusted. No formal order mandated this. It happened quietly through habit. By the end of February, the case file had doubled in size without increasing in clarity. Diagnoses were ruled out faster than new ones could be proposed. The hospital's role as a place of answers felt suddenly reversed. And in the spaces between charts and test results, something else began to form, not a conclusion but a shared hesitation. One that no record could fully capture, yet everyone seemed to understand. By early March, the case had acquired an informal nickname among night staff, never spoken where charts could hear it, never written down. It referred not to the child herself, but to her eyes. According to later testimony, the name began as a way to signal caution without explanation. A shorthand for be brief, be careful, don't linger. Hospital administration attempted to restore order through procedure. A rotation schedule limited how long any single nurse spent on the case. Observation periods were shortened. Notes were standardized. The goal, according to an internal memo, was to reduce subjective interpretation. In practice, it made the gaps more noticeable. One pediatric resident, Dr. Lila Morno, requested permission to run comparative vision tests using patterned cards and controlled movement. Her proposal was approved. The results were inconclusive but troubling. The infant responded to patterns not yet in her field of view. When shapes were hidden behind barriers, her gaze shifted as if tracking them anyway. Morno wrote, "Response suggests awareness without direct stimulus." The attending physician crossed out the sentence and replaced it with atypical anticipatory response. Outside the hospital, rumors began to surface. A janitor's cousin mentioned a strange baby at Arkansas Children's Hospital to a church group. Someone else added a detail they could not have known. By the end of the week, the story had reached the Harpers' hometown in a form barely recognizable, something about eyes that glowed, something about doctors being baffled. None of it was accurate. All of it increased pressure. On March 12, the hospital received a request from a private research foundation to review the case. The request cited the medical bulletin mention and proposed non-invasive study. It was declined. A note in the administrative log states simply, "Patient welfare prioritized." No one signed it. That same night, another incident occurred. A security guard reported motion in a closed observation room. When he checked the camera feed, the crib appeared empty. Physical inspection confirmed the infant was present. The camera had not malfunctioned before or since. The report was filed and archived without follow-up. Ellen Harper noticed changes too. She told a social worker that her daughter seemed to recognize people before they spoke, that she became still when strangers entered the room, alert in a way that did not resemble fear. When asked to elaborate, Harper said, "She looks through them first, then at them." The comment was recorded under parental perception. By late March, the case drew a quiet divide among staff. Some argued the anomalies were products of expectation and fatigue. Others believed something genuine was being missed, not supernatural but neurological in a way science had not yet named. Both groups agreed on one thing: the longer the case continued without explanation, the harder it became to treat it like any other. Dr. Wexler requested an external review panel. The request was approved in principle, delayed in practice. Scheduling conflicts, funding concerns, paperwork. Each delay added another layer of waiting. Meanwhile, the infant continued to develop normally in every respect except one. Her eyes remained unchanged, clear, responsive, and resistant to description. Nurses stopped trying to describe them altogether. And somewhere between what the charts allowed and what the ward felt, the case began to slip, quietly, from medicine into something harder to contain. April arrived with warmer air and an unease that no longer stayed confined to the ward. The child, now 6 weeks old, had reached milestones on schedule. Muscle tone, reflexes, feeding patterns, all normal. Only the eyes remained outside expectation, unchanged despite growth elsewhere. The longer the case continued, the more difficult it became to argue that time alone would clarify it. The external review panel finally convened in mid-April. 3 physicians attended in person, 1 remotely. Their specialties overlapped just enough to complicate discussion. Each reviewed the charts independently before meeting. When they spoke together, their language grew careful. One suggested an undocumented variant of visual processing. Another proposed synesthetic crossover between sensory regions. A third admitted in a later affidavit that none of the theories explained how the responses were occurring. Arkansas Children's Hospital had seen rare cases before. What distinguished this one was not severity, but persistence without deterioration. No decline, no crisis. Just an absence of explanation that refused to resolve itself. During the panel's second day, an ophthalmic exam produced a subtle but unsettling result. When light was shown directly into the child's eyes, the expected reflex occurred. When the light was extinguished, the reflection lingered, barely perceptible but measurable. Equipment was recalibrated. The result repeated once, then did not repeat again. The finding was recorded, then buried under qualifiers. That evening, Dr. Morneau remained after her shift, reviewing video footage taken during routine assessments. She later testified that while scrubbing through the recordings, she noticed moments where the child's gaze aligned with sounds that had not yet occurred, voices before they spoke, footsteps before they entered the frame. She did not report this formally. She mentioned it to a colleague, who advised her to rest. Hospital administration began discussing discharge planning. There was no medical justification to keep the child admitted indefinitely. Ellen Harper was informed that her daughter could likely go home by early May, with follow-up visits scheduled monthly. Harper did not object. She asked only whether the doctors would still be watching. The answer was yes, though no one could say how. In the final days before discharge, staff noticed a change, not in the child but in themselves. People spent less time in the room. Conversations there felt shorter. Eye contact between adults was avoided more than usual. These behaviors were never discussed, never acknowledged as unusual. On April 28, a small envelope was added to the case file. Inside was a handwritten note from a consulting neurologist who had declined to attend the panel. It read, "Some systems observe before they interact. We should consider whether we are assuming sequence where none exists." The note was unsigned. On May 2, 1988, the child was discharged. She left Arkansas Children's Hospital without a diagnosis, without restrictions, and without explanation. The case file was closed with a status rarely used, unresolved, stable. But for those who had worked closest to it, the feeling was not resolution. It was postponement. As though the most important part of the case had simply been moved out of view. The Harpers returned to Pine Bluff under a sky already thick with early summer heat. According to county welfare notes, the home visit conducted 2 weeks after discharge revealed nothing concerning. The infant slept, fed, and gained weight normally. The caseworker wrote, "Family adjusting well." No mention was made of the eyes. Neighbors, however, noticed immediately. A woman living across the street later recalled that the baby seemed too aware for her age. She did not cry when unfamiliar people approached. Instead, she grew still, watching. Another neighbor claimed the child reacted to passing cars before they turned onto the block, her head shifting slightly as though tracking something only she could sense. These observations were shared casually at first, dismissed with laughter or discomfort. Pine Bluff had seen its share of rumors and most faded quickly. But this one persisted, not because it grew louder, but because it stayed consistent. Follow-up appointments at Arkansas Children's Hospital continued through the summer. Each visit produced the same outcome. Growth within normal range. No new symptoms, no regression. The eyes remained unchanged. Doctors described them as healthy, responsive, and unremarkable, except that no one could explain why they behaved the way they did. Dr. Wexler remained involved longer than protocol required. In a private letter to a colleague, he admitted concern not over pathology but over limitation. "We have no language for this," he wrote, "and without language we default to dismissal." The first incident outside a clinical setting occurred in July. During a family gathering, the child, now 5 months old, was seated in a carrier near an open doorway. Several relatives reported that she began following something across the room that no one else could see. Her eyes moved steadily from one corner to another, then stopped. At that exact moment, a storm rolled in unexpectedly, knocking out power across the block. No one connected the two events aloud. Still, the timing unsettled those present. By August, Ellen Harper had begun keeping a notebook. The entries are spare and factual: dates, times, observations. Looks toward hall before footsteps. Stares at window before thunder. Does not blink when watched. The notebook was never shown to doctors. Harper later said she didn't want to give them something they would explain away. Rumors shifted tone as summer deepened. The language of medical confusion gave way to older frameworks. Some whispered that the child could see spirits. Others suggested she was sensitive to weather or sound or things beneath the river. No one said these things in front of the Harpers. In September, a local preacher visited the home uninvited. He asked to pray over the child. Ellen declined politely. Afterward, the preacher told his congregation only that some gifts require distance. Attendance dipped briefly, then recovered. By autumn, the case had faded from public attention but not from memory. The hospital file remained closed. The notebook continued to fill, and the girl's eyes, clear, layered, untroubled, continued to do exactly what they had always done. They watched. By the fall of 1988, the girl had become a quiet fixture in Pine Bluff, known but not discussed openly. Her parents did not seek attention, and the town learned quickly that questions were unwelcome. Still, the observations continued, collected in fragments that would later be pieced together through testimony and second-hand accounts. Daycare records show that the child rarely startled. Loud noises produced no flinch. Instead, caregivers noted moments of prolonged focus, particularly during periods when the room fell silent. One caregiver wrote, "Seems to wait for something before reacting." The note was filed under temperament and never revisited. In October, a pediatrician unaffiliated with Arkansas Children's Hospital conducted a routine check after the family requested a second opinion. His report mirrors earlier findings but includes a single, unusual sentence. Ocular engagement appears reciprocal rather than reactive. When asked to clarify, he later said he could not. The phrase did not appear in his subsequent work. Local school district files reveal that by year's end, the Harpers had declined early enrollment programs that required developmental screening beyond the standard. No explanation was given. The refusal drew no attention at the time. The first recorded disappearance connected to the case occurred in November, though it was not labeled as such until years later. A teenage neighbor, home alone one afternoon, reported hearing a child laughing from the Harper residence, while the family was known to be away. When the sound stopped abruptly, the teen walked over to check. She returned shaken, claiming the house felt occupied but empty. Her parents dismissed the story. No report was filed. Ellen Harper's notebook grows denser during this period. Entries begin to include emotional qualifiers for the first time. Feels like she's listening past us. Does not sleep during storms. Eyes change in low light, hard to explain. The handwriting tightens. Margins fill. A clipped newspaper article from December mentions an unrelated power outage affecting several blocks near the river. One line notes that a transformer failed without clear cause. A handwritten mark appears beside it in the margin of Harper's notebook. No comment accompanies the mark. That winter, visitors to the Harper home grew fewer, not because they were turned away, but because they found reasons not to stay long. Some complained of headaches. Others said the house felt disorienting after dark. These remarks never overlapped exactly, yet they shared a common hesitation. By the end of 1988, the girl had passed her first year without diagnosis, without incidents severe enough to demand intervention, and without any reduction in the questions surrounding her eyes. The hospital file remained unchanged. The town moved on, but within the Harper household something subtle had shifted. Observation was no longer one-sided. Ellen wrote in her notebook on December 29, "She knows when I'm writing." The entry is underlined twice. The new year brought no formal change, but it did bring distance. In early January of 1989, Ellen Harper withdrew her daughter from daycare without explanation. County records list the reason as family preference. No follow-up was conducted. From that point on, most accounts of the child came indirectly, through neighbors, relatives, and later testimony gathered after memory had already begun to blur. Those who did see the girl during that winter described a marked stillness. She sat for long periods without distraction, her gaze fixed just above eye level, as though following something that never quite entered the room. One relative remarked that she seemed older when she looked, younger when she moved. The phrase appeared again years later in an unrelated affidavit. A pediatric home visit nurse assigned briefly to the family recorded no medical concerns, but added a personal note at the bottom of her report. Child does not seek reassurance through eye contact. The sentence was crossed out, then rewritten more neutrally. The original wording remains visible beneath the ink. By February, rumors had thinned but sharpened. What little was said focused less on abnormality and more on unease. A neighbor claimed the girl reacted to people standing outside the house, even when no sound was made. Another said the child turned toward the back door minutes before someone knocked. Each story was dismissed individually. Together, they formed a pattern no one wanted to name. A request for reevaluation was submitted to Arkansas Children's Hospital that spring, not by the parents, but by a consulting physician who had reviewed the case informally. The request was denied. The hospital's response cited the absence of clinical deterioration and referenced the original assessments conducted in 1988. The case number appeared again, unchanged. That summer, Ellen Harper stopped writing regularly in her notebook. When she did, the entries grew shorter. Watches corners, sleeps facing window, does not like mirrors. No explanations followed. The final dated entry from July reads, "I don't think she sees wrong, I think she sees more." After that, the notebook falls silent. By autumn, the Harpers had begun planning a move. Utility records show service transfers requested for a rural address outside county limits. No reason was given. The move was completed quietly, without farewells or announcements. When asked later why they left, Ellen said only that the house had become too open. In Pine Bluff, the girl faded into absence. Stories lingered, but without a subject they softened. The hospital never reopened the file. The doctors moved on to cases that fit existing language. Yet for those who had watched her longest, one question remained unresolved. Not what the girl could see, but whether what she saw had noticed her back. The Harper family's departure left a quiet gap that records did not immediately explain. The rural address they relocated to lay near the edge of Jefferson County, where census updates were slow and neighbors scarce. Utility logs confirm occupancy. School enrollment records do not. For nearly a year, the girl existed only in medical files that were no longer being updated and in memories that were already shifting. The first trace after the move appears in a handwritten letter dated March 1989, sent to a distant cousin. In it, Ellen Harper described the new house as quieter but not empty. She mentioned that her daughter slept better there, especially when curtains were kept open at night. The letter makes no reference to the eyes. It does mention storms. "She wakes before them," Ellen wrote. "Always before." County road maintenance logs from that spring include a brief note about repeated calls concerning lights seen in an unoccupied field near the Harper property. Each time, deputies found nothing. No report was filed beyond the initial notation. The calls stopped by early summer. A visiting minister later claimed he felt disoriented while praying in the home, as though the room had shifted subtly around him. He did not return. His testimony appears only in a personal journal discovered years later, not in church records. By late 1989, the girl reached an age when vision assessments would normally clarify developmental anomalies. None were conducted. The parents declined further testing, citing previous evaluations and a desire for privacy. No authority intervened. There was no medical justification to do so. Neighbors described the child as polite, quiet, and distant. She spoke late, but when she did, her language was precise. One neighbor recalled her asking why adults looked away when she stared at them. The question was never answered. The Arkansas Children's Hospital case number resurfaced once more that year, referenced casually during a departmental audit of unresolved files. A junior administrator noted that the case had never technically been closed, only suspended. A supervisor initialed the margin and wrote, "No further action." As 1989 ended, the girl remained healthy by every measurable standard. No illness, no distress, no escalation that would justify intervention. What persisted was the same unclassifiable detail that had begun the case, the sense that her gaze did not merely receive information, but selected it. And in the absence of documentation, that detail drifted where so many others do, into rumor, into habit, into the unspoken adjustments people make when something refuses to be named. By early 1990, the girl had entered a phase of development that should have narrowed the field of uncertainty. Language acquisition, social response, visual focus. Each milestone offered an opportunity for classification. None delivered it. According to a pediatric evaluation conducted privately that February, the child demonstrated age-appropriate comprehension and motor skills, but her visual engagement remained atypical. The physician wrote, "Eye contact sustained longer than normative ranges, effective response delayed." He recommended monitoring. The family did not return. That spring, a curious sequence of events unfolded near the Harper property. County Animal Control received 2 separate calls reporting livestock refusing to cross a fence line bordering the family's land. When officers investigated, they found nothing obstructing the path. The animals simply would not pass a particular point, turning away each time as if encountering an unseen boundary. The reports were closed without follow-up. A school readiness assessment was scheduled for the fall. It never occurred. The Harpers withdrew their daughter before the visit, stating they intended to homeschool. This decision was noted and accepted. No one objected. The girl remained officially enrolled nowhere. What little information comes from this period arrives through later testimony. A neighbor recalled that the child spent long stretches outdoors, standing still and watching the tree line. Another claimed she spoke rarely, but when she did, she asked questions that felt out of order, not inappropriate but premature. "Why do people pretend not to see?" was one remembered phrase. No context survived. In August, a brief but unsettling incident was recorded in a sheriff's log. A passerby reported seeing a young child standing alone near the roadside at dusk, staring into oncoming headlights. When deputies arrived minutes later, the road was empty. The report includes a note, "Possibly mistaken identity." The Harper address was listed nearby, then crossed out. That same month, a local optometrist attending a continuing education seminar in Little Rock mentioned the case in conversation, unaware of its sensitivity. Another physician recognized the description immediately. The two spoke briefly, then stopped. Neither wrote about it later. Both would later deny discussing it at all. By the end of 1990, the girl had become something like a negative space in the record, defined more by where documentation ceased than where it continued. The hospital file remained unchanged. The county records thinned. The notebook Ellen Harper once kept was never resumed. Yet the stories did not end. They simply lost their center. People who had encountered the child remembered the eyes first, and then the feeling that followed, of being observed without being understood, of sequence reversed. These memories surfaced sporadically, often years apart, always without prompting. And somewhere in rural Arkansas, within the same quiet stretch of land, the girl continued to grow, healthy, unexamined, and carrying with her the unanswered question that no doctor, no chart, and no explanation had ever managed to settle. The winter of 1990 passed without incident, and that absence itself became notable. No reports, no calls, no stray remarks in county logs. It was as if the case had slipped entirely out of the systems designed to notice it. What remained were impressions, carried by people who could not quite let go of them. In January of 1991, a substitute teacher filling in at a rural homeschool cooperative mentioned a child who unsettled her, not through behavior, but through attention. The girl, whose name was not recorded, did not disrupt lessons or speak out of turn. She simply watched. The teacher later said it felt as though the child was waiting for the lesson to catch up to her. The cooperative disbanded that spring for unrelated reasons. A brief reference appears in a county health audit that same year. It lists a pediatric case from 1988 as never formally resolved. The notation is followed by a recommendation to update classification codes. No update followed. The audit was filed and forgotten. Neighbors near the Harper property continued to note odd but non-actionable details. Radio interference during storms, dogs refusing to enter certain rooms, a persistent sense that the house was occupied even when empty. None of this reached law enforcement or medical authorities. It lived instead in conversation, where credibility erodes quickly. One detail, repeated often enough to matter, concerned mirrors. Several visitors claimed the child avoided reflective surfaces, positioning herself so her face did not align fully with them. When asked why, one remembered her saying, "They don't show it right." The comment was relayed secondhand, then dismissed as misremembered. By mid-1991, the Harpers themselves became harder to locate. Mail forwarding requests expired. Utility usage dropped, then ceased. A property tax note from December lists the residence as vacant or intermittently occupied. No explanation was given. The family had not reported a move. The final hospital reference to the case appears in a training seminar outline dated early 1992. It mentions an infant with unexplained ocular behavior as an example of diagnostic humility. No name, no outcome, just the reminder that not every case yields language. Within the 50-year window of this record, that is where documentation ends. What happens next survives only in fragments. Accounts from hikers who claim to see a child watching them from tree lines, stories from locals who spoke of a girl who aged without leaving traces, and one unverified claim from a county clerk who said a birth record and a death record briefly shared the same file number before one vanished. These stories do not agree on details. They agree only on the eyes, clear, reflective, and fixed on something just beyond where others were looking. In Arkansas, where quiet places outnumber witnesses, such stories rarely resolve. They thin out, drift, and eventually settle into the land itself. And somewhere between what was recorded and what was felt, the question remains open, not of what the girl could see, but of what might have been looking back. In the early months of 1992, the case resurfaced briefly in an unexpected place, not medicine but paperwork. A routine reconciliation of archived files at Arkansas Children's Hospital flagged a discrepancy. Case H8814 appeared twice in an index, once under resolved neonatal care and once under pending review. The duplication was corrected with a single line through one entry. No explanation was added. The name attached to the number was not written out in either place. A former resident physician, reviewing old materials for teaching purposes, recalled the case during an interview years later. He described it as the one we learned restraint from. When pressed, he said the child's presentation had forced the staff to confront the limits of interpretation. "We kept trying to make sequence fit," he said. "Cause, then effect. But the behavior suggested the reverse." He did not elaborate. In rural Jefferson County, the land where the Harpers had lived remained intermittently occupied. Property records show short-term leases that never renewed. Tenants cited ordinary reasons for leaving: commutes, repairs, changing plans, but several mentioned, in separate statements, an inability to sleep in the back rooms of the house. One described feeling observed without presence. None used the child's name. A county road crew assigned to repair a culvert near the property noted an unusual pattern in sound. Their foreman wrote that voices seemed to flatten near the tree line, as if absorbed. The note was filed under environmental conditions and never revisited. Similar remarks appear in older Ozark folklore, usually tied to hollows and bends where sound behaves strangely. No connection was made. That summer, a pediatric conference in Little Rock included a panel on rare sensory integration disorders. During a question-and-answer session, an audience member asked whether anticipatory gaze could occur without neurological damage. The panelist paused, then replied that medicine occasionally encountered phenomena before it found names for them. No examples were given. Several attendees later said they thought of the Arkansas case at the same moment. The Harpers themselves left little trace. A single forwarding address led to another, then ended. School records never resumed. Medical follow-ups were never logged. The absence was not dramatic, it was administrative, the kind that occurs when no rule is broken and no threshold crossed. By the end of 1992, the girl would have been nearly 5. There is no photograph on file from that year, no formal assessment, only a handful of recollections that agree on one detail. When people tried to meet her gaze, they felt late, as though the moment they were responding to had already passed. In Arkansas, such details tend to persist not as claims, but as cautions. They settle into the background, shaping behavior quietly. And so the case continued, not in charts or diagnoses, but in the small adjustments people made when they felt seen before they arrived. By 1993, the story had thinned enough that it could no longer be traced cleanly, only inferred. What remained of the case lived in secondary references, mentions without context, reactions without causes. The girl herself had become a silhouette in the record, defined more by how others adjusted around her than by any direct description. A rural librarian in Jefferson County later recalled a child who spent long afternoons standing between shelves, not reading, not moving, simply watching patrons enter the building. The librarian remembered this because the girl never startled when spoken to from behind. "It was like she heard you before you made noise," she said. No name was taken. No complaint filed. The child stopped appearing after a few months. That same year, a private optometry practice in southern Arkansas logged a canceled appointment under the initials EH. The reason given was evaluation declined. The optometrist later testified that the cancellation followed a brief phone call in which the parent asked whether the doctor believed eyes could work correctly while seeing incorrectly. The optometrist could not recall how he answered. County welfare reviews from 1993 show no active cases connected to the Harper family. The absence was not suspicious. It was procedural. Without reports of harm or neglect, there was nothing to pursue. The system, designed to respond to crisis, passed over quiet continuity without notice. Folklore adapted slowly. The story, when told, no longer centered on doctors or hospitals. It focused instead on timing. People said the girl knew when someone was coming, that she looked toward places before things happened there, that she grew uneasy not in darkness but in artificial light. These were not claims made loudly. They were shared the way one shares weather advice. A professor of psychology at a state college later referenced an unnamed case in a lecture on perception, describing a child whose anticipatory responses disrupted traditional stimulus models. He framed it as a thought experiment, not a report. Several students remembered the lecture years later, though none could locate it in course materials. What distinguished this period was the absence of escalation. Nothing worsened. Nothing resolved. The girl did not disappear. She simply ceased to be accessible to systems that relied on schedules, records, and categories. The last personal account from someone who claimed direct interaction appears in a letter dated November 1993. The writer, a distant relative, described meeting the girl briefly at a family gathering. "She did not look strange," the letter reads. "She looked patient." The writer added that when the girl met her eyes, she felt as though she had interrupted something already in progress. After that, even second-hand accounts become rare. Within the bounds of this record, the case does not end. It dissolves into land, into rumor, into the quiet understanding that some forms of difference do not announce themselves loudly enough to be captured. And in Arkansas, where stories often persist long after names are forgotten, the girl with the unexplainable eyes remained present only as an impression, one that suggested not danger but a reversal of attention. Not what are you looking at, but why do you already know I'm here? By 1994, the girl's absence had become her defining feature. She was no longer spoken of as a child living somewhere in Arkansas, but as an event that had passed through it. What few references remained were indirect, framed as cautionary anecdotes rather than claims. A rural school counselor later recounted a brief enrollment inquiry made that spring. The parents asked detailed questions about observation rooms, mirrors, and lighting conditions. When told such accommodations were unnecessary, they declined to proceed. The counselor remembered the conversation only because the question seemed less about education than about visibility. No names were recorded. That summer, a series of small but consistent reports emerged from hikers near the White River corridor. Several claimed to feel watched while crossing certain stretches of trail. None described seeing anyone. A park log notes one entry that reads, "No visual contact." Strong sense of presence. The notation was initialed and filed without comment. Similar phrases appear in older Arkansas folklore, usually tied to wooded areas where sound carries poorly. A retired nurse from Arkansas Children's Hospital, interviewed in 1994 for an oral history project, mentioned the 1988 case briefly. She did not use the child's name. "We were looking for damage," she said, "but there was no damage, just function we couldn't place." When asked whether she believed the eyes were abnormal, she paused. "They were complete," she replied. That was the trouble. The hospital itself had moved on. Diagnostic frameworks evolved. Imaging improved. New terms entered the field. None were retroactively applied to case H8814. The file remained unchanged, untouched by revision or reclassification. In private conversation, some doctors admitted they remembered the case less for what it showed than for what it demanded. That observation itself might not be neutral. That being seen could affect the observer as much as the observed. These were philosophical concerns, not medical ones. They were not written down. Local stories continued to flatten with repetition. Details faded. Only the core sensation remained. Eye contact that felt delayed, as though the response came after the meaning had already been taken. People stopped asking what the girl could see. They asked what it meant to be seen first. By the end of 1994, the trail of records ended entirely. No school files, no medical updates, no confirmed sightings. The girl had not vanished in any dramatic sense. She had simply stepped outside the reach of systems that required explanation. And in Arkansas, where quiet persistence often outlasts documentation, that was enough. The case did not close. It thinned, leaving behind an outline shaped by memory rather than fact, and a question that no longer expected an answer. In 1995, the story surfaced one last time in an official setting, though few recognized it as such. A state-level review of unusual pediatric cases included a brief, anonymized entry describing persistent anticipatory visual engagement without correlating pathology. The summary listed no outcomes and offered no recommendations. It functioned less as a case study than as a reminder of uncertainty. Those who had worked on the original file recognized the language immediately. Outside institutions, the narrative had already settled into something quieter. In Jefferson County, people spoke less about a girl and more about a feeling, an awareness that arrived before sound or movement. Parents told children to trust that feeling. Hunters mentioned it when describing why they left certain woods early. None of them connected these habits back to a specific person anymore. A former neighbor of the Harpers, interviewed years later, recalled seeing a young girl near the edge of a field one evening in late summer. The child stood still, facing the road, her eyes catching the last light. The neighbor slowed, unsure whether to stop. By the time she decided, the field was empty. She told no one at the time. The memory returned only when asked. That autumn, a small fire damaged records at a county annex building. Among the files listed as lost were several outdated welfare summaries and property notes from the late 1980s. No investigation followed. The loss was deemed minor. Still, it erased one of the last paper trails that might have anchored the story to a place. Psychology students at a nearby college were assigned a thought experiment around that time. Imagine perception without sequence, knowing without waiting for stimulus. The exercise had no direct connection to the Arkansas case, yet several students later said it felt uncomfortably familiar, as though it described something already known rather than hypothetical. By winter, even second-hand accounts had grown scarce. The girl had become less a subject than a reference point, invoked only when language failed. People spoke of moments when they felt watched before being seen or recognized before arriving. They did not ask why. Within the limits of this record, the girl's life continued somewhere beyond documentation, healthy, unexamined, and unremarkable in every way except one. Her eyes, unchanged from birth, had never been explained. They had simply been accommodated. And in Arkansas, where quiet things often endure longer than loud ones, that accommodation became the final response, not an answer, but an understanding that some cases do not resolve. They withdraw. By 1996, the case existed only as a faint imprint on professional memory and a deeper one on local instinct. No one searched for the girl anymore. No agency listed her as missing. There was no trigger to reopen anything. The systems that once circled her had completed their function by failing to hold her. What endured instead were patterns. A county dispatcher later recalled a string of calls from the mid-1990s that shared an odd similarity. Callers would report a person standing near a road or field, only to retract the report moments later. False alarm, they would say. Must have been the light. When logs were reviewed years afterward, the locations clustered loosely along the same rural corridor where the Harpers had once lived. A psychology graduate student researching sensory anticipation interviewed several clinicians in Arkansas that year. One physician mentioned an infant case from the late 1980s, carefully avoiding detail. "We kept trying to find what was wrong," he said, instead of asking whether we were measuring the right thing. The quote never made it into the final paper. A former nurse, now retired, admitted privately that she still thought about the girl when teaching her grandchildren not to stare. "Some looking invites a response," she said, "and sometimes you don't know who answers." She laughed when she said it, but she did not clarify. The house the Harpers once occupied changed owners again that year. Renovation plans were announced, then quietly abandoned. Contractors cited structural issues that never appeared on inspection reports. One worker claimed the back rooms felt unfinished, though nothing appeared wrong. The term echoed earlier descriptions, resurfacing without explanation. No folklore ever solidified around the girl. There were no names, no legends, no warnings carved into trees. Only an adjustment, a way of standing slightly aside when something felt out of order, even if no reason presented itself. By the late 1990s, even that adjustment began to fade. New families moved in. New routines replaced old ones. The land absorbed what it always does: footprints, then memory, then silence. Within the boundaries of this story, the girl was never harmed, never institutionalized, never explained. She did not vanish. She simply moved beyond the reach of attention that demanded sequence, diagnosis, and closure. And in Arkansas, where the quiet often outlasts the documented, that was enough. By 1997, the case no longer existed as a narrative anyone could easily recount from beginning to end. It survived instead as fragments, comments made without context, reactions without names attached. Those who remembered it did so unevenly, recalling different details but sharing the same unease. A county clerk reviewing old birth records that year noticed a brief irregularity. One file showed an annotation indicating follow-up correspondence that no longer existed. The notation had been initialed, then struck through. When the clerk asked a supervisor about it, she was told the file had already been reviewed and required no action. The matter ended there. In a small community college outside Little Rock, an instructor teaching abnormal psychology referenced an unnamed case during a lecture on perception. He spoke about the difficulty of defining normal when a system functions consistently but outside expectation. A student later recalled the instructor saying, "Sometimes the problem isn't that something is broken. It's that it doesn't need us the way we expect it to." The lecture notes do not include the example. Around the same time, hikers along a wooded stretch near the White River reported the recurring sensation of being watched from a distance, not closely but attentively. Park staff logged the comments under visitor experience, not safety. No sightings were reported, only the feeling. One retired physician from Arkansas Children's Hospital, interviewed informally that year, admitted the 1988 case still bothered him. "We assumed observation was passive," he said, "but what if it is?" He offered no theory, only the admission that the assumption itself had never been questioned until then. The Harper family did not resurface. No new records appeared. No conflicting information emerged. The absence remained consistent, which made it difficult to challenge. The girl would have been approaching 10 years old by then. There is no documentation of where she was or what she had become. What endured instead was a subtle behavioral shift in those who had encountered the story early on. They hesitated before meeting a stranger's gaze. They felt discomfort when attention lingered too long. These habits were never attributed to a single cause. They simply felt learned. By the close of 1997, the case had reached its quiet conclusion, not through resolution but through dispersal. It no longer belonged to medicine or law or rumor alone. It belonged to the shared space between them, where explanation thins and experience takes over. And in Arkansas, where many stories end not with answers but with accommodation, the girl with the unexplainable eyes remained what she had always been, a presence defined not by what was seen, but by how it changed the act of looking itself. By 1998, the case had reached the outer edge of memory where stories stop being told and begin being assumed. Those who still recalled the girl did not speak of her directly. They spoke instead of moments, brief, unsettled pauses when attention seemed to arrive before sound, when a presence felt established before it was visible. A rural mail carrier working the Jefferson County route that year mentioned, in a casual conversation later recorded, that certain houses along his path made him uneasy to approach. Not abandoned, he clarified, just already aware. He could not explain what he meant, only that he felt expected there, even when no one answered the door. A state pediatric review board convened that autumn to assess unresolved cases from the previous decade. Case H-8814 appeared once more, flagged only because it had never been formally closed. The summary offered no new information. One reviewer wrote, "No pathology demonstrated, outcome unknown." The file was marked inactive. This time it did not reappear. In local conversation, the girl's story flattened into a single sentence. There was a child who could see too early. No one agreed on what that meant. No one asked for clarification. The sentence carried enough weight on its own. A former neighbor of the Harpers later claimed that years after the family had moved, she saw a young girl standing near the tree line at dusk, watching the road. The girl did not wave. She did not move. When headlights passed, the field was empty. The neighbor never reported the sighting. She mentioned it only once in a conversation that drifted quickly to other things. What remained consistent across all accounts was the absence of threat. No harm followed, no violence, no escalation. The unease was quiet, observational, and fleeting. It did not demand response, it asked only to be noticed. By the end of 1998, even that faded. New routines replaced old ones. The land changed hands. The systems that once brushed against the case completed their cycles and moved on. Yet the impression persisted, not of a child with strange eyes, but of an inversion. Of being observed before observing, of attention that did not wait its turn. In Arkansas, where time moves differently depending on where you stand, such inversions tend to linger, not as stories told, but as instincts carried. And for those who remembered the case at all, it left behind a single, unsettled thought. Some forms of seeing do not belong to the observer alone. The final trace of the case does not appear in a file, but in a habit that settled quietly across those who had brushed against it. By the end of the 1990s, there was nothing left to investigate in any formal sense. No symptoms worsened. No crisis arrived. The girl with the unexplainable eyes had not vanished in a way that triggered alarms. She had simply moved beyond the reach of systems that required sequence and proof. At Arkansas Children's Hospital, the case lingered only as an example mentioned in passing, an early lesson in restraint. New doctors were taught how to rule things out, how to proceed carefully when certainty failed. No one spoke of the child directly. They spoke of limits, of how observation itself can shape what is seen, of how not every difference announces itself as damage. In Jefferson County, the places associated with the story changed hands and purpose. Houses were renovated or left alone. Fields grew back in. Trails shifted. Nothing marked the land as special. And yet, those who knew the story continued to adjust in small ways, averting their eyes when attention felt too precise, pausing when the air seemed expectant, trusting the moment before sound. No legend hardened around the girl. There were no names to invoke, no warnings carved into memory. Only a quiet understanding that the order of things, look, then know, hear, then react, had once been reversed, and that the reversal had felt complete rather than broken. Within the bounds of this record, that is where the story closes. Not with an answer, but with an echo. A sense that somewhere in Arkansas, beyond documentation and diagnosis, a way of seeing existed that did not wait for permission or explanation. And if now and then someone feels noticed before they arrive, if attention seems to precede presence, they rarely speak of it. They do what the people closest to the case learned to do long ago. They adjust, they move on, and they leave the question where it belongs, open, quiet, and watching.